Wellesley-Weston Lifetime Learning offers non-credit courses to seniors in the greater Boston area. For more information about WWLL and links to our videos, please go to www.llcourses.org.
Our speaker today is Paul Willien, who's a senior economist and policy advisor at Federal Reserve Bank of Boston Research Department. And his research has focused on household financial management, and he recently has spent a good bit of time studying mortgage markets. And his research appears in the Review of Economics, Economic Theory, the Journal of Finance, the Journal of Public Economists, the Journal of Urban Economics, and others. Also, the Brookings Papers on Economic Activity. Prior to joining the Boston Fed in 2004, Willien was on the faculty at Princeton University and the University of Chicago. He's a visiting lecturer at Harvard University and has been a visiting member of the faculty at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He did his undergraduate work at Williams and earned his PhD from Yale University. And he is back after speaking several times in the past, and so we welcome him.
Anne never mentions one other detail, which is that I'm her son-in-law. So the first slide. So the first slide here is a disclaimer. I'm speaking today as a researcher and as a concerned citizen, and not as a representative of the Boston Fed. Or of the Federal Reserve System. And this is the head, this is Jay Powell, who's the chairman of the board, to whom I indirectly report. But it's important to understand that I'm not speaking, these are entirely my opinions, and they're not. When I say we, I'm referring to my colleagues, certain colleagues of mine at the Boston Fed, and my in-laws. And not Jay and me. Okay, so I'm going to do three things today. I'm going to discuss a little about how the economy is doing right now, with a focus on how and how that plays into Federal Reserve decision making, and then I'll talk about the labor market, which is where we focus most of our attention in trying to understand how the economy is doing, and I'll explain why. And then I'll talk about trade, which is sort of the important issue of the day, and I think represents the biggest risk to our forecast of how the economy is doing. Okay, so the economy is doing very well. It is, actually, I should update this slide. So the picture is updated, but the text is not, although it's more or less. Employment continues to grow at about, it's a little over 1% per year. And it's been growing at that rate since the trough of the recession, which occurred for labor markets at the beginning of 2010. So this is not the longest recovery yet, but it's getting close. The longest expansion in American history. And we're up actually about 8% in terms of employment since the previous cycle, and probably about 15% since the trough of employment in the beginning of 2010. So the economy is doing very, very well. If we look just at Massachusetts, since that's where we live, or the Boston metro area, you can see that the Boston metro area in some ways is doing, in some sense, even better, but that's largely because we didn't suffer nearly as much as the rest of the country in the bust. So employment fell here, as it did everywhere, but it fell much less than it did. But the recovery, we didn't pay for that in the recovery. The recovery has been as strong here as it has been elsewhere. So I'll come back to this in a little bit, but the concept of unemployment, you might think that if employment is up, then unemployment must be down, and that's true, but the two concepts are different. So employment measures people who are working, who are employed, but to be unemployed is much narrower than not working. So most people who are not working are not unemployed. To be unemployed, in some deep sense, you need to want to work and not be able to find a job. And so I'll come back to this when I discuss labor markets about various different ways of measuring it. But the standard way we measure it, unemployment is now about 4%, so about 4% of people, so that's the sum of all people who are either employed, of all people who want to work, about 96% have jobs right now. And that, you can see, is a low number. So the last time it was this low was at the very end of the 2000s, in the dot-com boom. And it's significantly lower than the unemployment rate was at the peak of the last cycle, which was to say in 2007, when unemployment got to around a little under, somewhere around 4.4%. So measured by unemployment, the economy is also doing exceptionally well. And finally, I just wanted to point out that if we look at personal income in per capita terms, so income has been growing since the end of the last cycle, and at least in nominal terms, is significantly higher than it was even at the peak of the last cycle. But I showed you everything comparing Massachusetts and the rest of the country. And one thing that's important to understand about, I think, kind of illustrates why in different parts of the country we see the economy differently. Massachusetts' household income is much higher than it is in the rest of the country. So it's like 30% higher than it is in the rest of the country. And that has not always been true. So in 1980, so now close to 40 years ago, Massachusetts, household income in Massachusetts was about the same as it was in the rest of the country. And so something happened in 1980 that dramatically changed the distribution of income in the United States, and that was that the pay to educated people, to people with a college education, pulled away dramatically from income for people with a high school education or less. And since the share of college graduates in Massachusetts is about twice as high as the rest of the country, that shift disproportionately benefited places like Boston. And so Boston, New York, Washington, San Francisco, all those cities where you have a large percentage of college graduates, income in those cities pulled away from the rest of the country. And to some extent, in terms of understanding why some people see a very bleak future, and, well, when we talk about international trade, see all kinds of drastic remedies to our current economic situation, to some extent this picture illustrates why there's such divergence among Americans about what we need to do in economic policy. So what do we do at the Fed? So the Federal Reserve, basically, our job is to do what we can to manage the economy. And so when you look at this picture here, so unemployment that's the blue line there, right, is a bad thing. We generally don't like unemployment. And so one of our jobs is to, ideally would be to get rid of it to the extent that we can. And so let me try and explain to you how economists think about this question and what our role is in managing that. Okay, so the national economy, what we think of, we can think about economic activity in three different ways. One of them is expenditure. That's how much people spend. And so the types of spending in the economy, the C and I and G, that stands for consumption. That's what we spend on everything. It's mostly services. But so, for example, your cable bill, your electricity bill, your gas bill, plus going out to dinner, plus going on vacation, those are all consumption. Then there's investment. Most of investment is done by firms, but a big portion of investment is residential investment, which is often done by households. And then the last component of spending is government spending. And so that's expenditure, and that's one way to measure how much activity is going on in an economy. The second way is to look at income, and that's just to look at how much money people earn. And then the last one is to look at how much the economy produces. And so we just take the sum, the dollar value of all the things that the economy produces. And the starting point for macroeconomics, for the study of the economy as a whole, is the idea that these three things have to be equal. How much people spend, where do they get the money to spend? They get it from income, and if they spend it, it has to be produced by someone. And so all those things have to be equal. Okay, so what does the Federal Reserve do? Well, we control one important interest rate. And through that interest rate, we can stimulate the economy by inducing firms in particular to invest more. Or if we want to put the brakes on, we can raise interest rates. So we lower interest rates. That leads to more investment. That stimulates the economy. And that leads to more expenditure. And if there's more expenditure, then there's more income, and there's more production, and the economy produces more. And so what we do, and so if we want to, we can pull back and we can lower expenditure, lower income, and lower production. And so that's what we do at the Fed. And so when you look at this, of course, the natural question to ask is, if we can increase production by lowering interest rates, why don't we just always increase production as much as we can? In fact, why don't we just set interest rates infinitely low so that we just produce an infinite amount and everything would be great. And everybody would have more stuff than they knew what to do with. Okay, and so this is the problem. The reason why we don't do this is that we have some idea that there's some capacity that the economy can produce. And so if you stimulate the economy and the economy can produce more, then that's good. The economy produces more. But the problem is that we could be also at capacity. And what happens if we increase expenditure? What happens if we stimulate the economy? The economy can't produce anymore, right? So people want to buy more stuff. People want to go on more vacations. They want to build more houses. They want to buy more cars. But the economy is going flat out. The economy cannot produce anymore. And so what happens then? Well, the theory is that what happens then is that instead of the economy producing more, instead prices start going up and we get inflation. And so then what happens is that expenditure We stimulate the economy, but we're stuck at capacity, and the stimulus leads to inflation. And so the challenge for the Federal Reserve and the challenge for policymakers is how do we keep expenditure, income, and production as close to capacity as possible without going too high. Because if we go too high, we just get inflation. And so the job of most economists in the Federal Reserve System and most macroeconomists is basically trying to figure out how close we are to capacity, or whether we're above capacity, and where capacity is, so that we can make sure that we keep this as close to capacity as possible. And so, as I said, in theory, what we have is the power to increase expenditure. Through cutting interest rates, we have the power to get people to spend more. But our ability to get the economy to produce more is going to depend on whether that increased spending can actually be channeled into increased production, or whether it just turns into inflation. And so the big question, as I said, is how do we measure capacity? And the answer is we measure it typically by looking at unemployment. And so the idea is that if there is the unemployment rate, remember I said it's workers who want to work but can't find a job. If there are workers out there who want to work and can't find a job, then we think there's spare capacity out there. If there aren't workers, then we can't. And so the big question has always been really to focus on the unemployment rate, and that's the number that economists have always, in the modern era, that's the number we really focus on. Are we above, is there room to expand the economy without causing inflation? And that we measure by something about the unemployment rate. Okay, so the important thing, though, is in this picture, you'd say, well, if we're I thought I updated this picture, but if we're over here, right, so we're actually down about here, and you look at this and you say we still have 4% of the workforce that's unemployed. So about 4% of the people who want jobs can't find them. And that seems like there's some capacity there. So 4%, you always have to remember how big the U.S. economy is, right? That's like 6 million people. And so you might say, well, we have a lot of spare capacity. The U.S. economy, the Fed should lower interest rates or keep interest rates low because we have lots of room. There are lots of unemployed workers out there. But the problem is that we think some of those workers are basically between jobs. And so when a worker quits or is laid off from a job, they don't always find a job immediately afterwards. And so we have this kind of inventory of workers who are in between jobs, and we think that that inventory is not zero. And so somewhere around here, we get to the point where all the workers who are out looking for jobs are basically people who just haven't found a job yet. And if you stimulate the economy, they're not going to find the jobs any more quickly. And so you may be at capacity at 4%, even though there are still some unemployed workers. And so the big debate is where that magic number is. And so in the 1950s, the number was thought to be in the 3s. Then in the 1980s, people revised their beliefs and thought that 6% was a reasonable measure of capacity, and then that came down, and then we thought it was 4%, and we just keep moving around. And so one of the problems is right now, and when I show you now in the labor market, is in trying to understand whether we're at capacity or not. whether the economy could produce more than it does. Okay, so let me now go into discussion of the labor market. I'm going to skip. I'll explain this to you in just a second. Just show you the picture. So there are. This is the unemployment rate. So this has been updated, and you can see this is 2016, 17, and 18. And since 2016, the unemployment rate has fallen by about a point. And so, as I said, the unemployment rate measures all the workers who can't find work, and then it's as a share of the labor force, which is all workers who want to work. And as I said, that means either people who are already working, we assume that if you're working, you want to work, and then plus all the people who are looking for jobs. Okay, so that is that's what the unemployment rate is. And you can see where you get problems here in thinking about this, because we're really thinking about this question of who are the people to measure this. We would have to have some idea of who it is who wants to work. And so actually let me skip to this. The labor force, that's the share of all people who want to work. The labor force participation rate tells you what percentage of the population wants to work. And the way we define that is, this comes from a survey called the Current Population Survey, which the census carries out every month. And they survey 50,000 households. And they ask them a bunch of questions. So they never ask them whether they're unemployed or whether they're in the labor force. They'll ask them, they're very careful to ask the questions in a way that doesn't direct them to an answer. It's the statisticians who come up with the answer. So for example, for employed people, they don't ask you, are you employed? They ask you, how many hours did you work in the previous week? And then if you didn't work, then they ask you, what did you do? And they ask you, one of the things you may have done is to look for work. And so to identify someone as in the labor force, they ask you if you're employed, as I said, how many hours you worked in the previous week. And then if you didn't, then they ask you questions about what you did. And so to get into the labor force, you need to have looked for work at some point in the last 4 weeks. And that would be because you said in your interview, when they ask you what you did, one of the things you did was to look for work. So you filled out job applications, or you went to interviews, or you went to a job fair. That would get you into the labor force. And that's how we identify it, and that's how we compute the unemployment rate. So the labor force participation rate is around 63%. 37% of the population, by our count, or by the Bureau of Labor Statistics count, the idea is that 37% of the population doesn't want to work. And the big categories there are retired people and homemakers. So that accounts for about 37% of the population. And the other thing we can look at is this employment to population ratio, and that tells us just what share of the people in the economy are working. And you can see it's around 60%. So this gap here between the labor force and employment, that's another way of measuring unemployment. That's the same thing. And so generally, this number, as I said, we consider that a low number. There are tricky things about this, because one of the things that's happened in the last, really in the last 10 years, but it's been going on now in some ways for much longer, is we've seen declines in labor force participation. And so what's tricky about that is that if people stop looking for work, then they leave the labor force and they leave the pool of unemployed workers. And so the unemployment rate can come down either because people find jobs or because people more people choose not to look for work. And that's why it's always been a somewhat tricky thing, and so we don't know if 4% is low or not, partly because we don't know what fraction of the people in the outside the labor force, the people who aren't working, who aren't looking for work, would look for work, might change their mind and look for work. Okay. Hold on. Okay. And so there are other definitions of unemployment. This is from the president. So what he said is that he had heard unemployment, the people that this number we give, quote, 4%, so it was 5.3% when he said this, that number was a fiction. He had heard numbers as high as 42%. So what is he quoting? He's quoting the number he heard. He actually was right. There was a number of 42%. That's the employment to population ratio, or in other words, that's 42% is the share of able-bodied adults who are not working. And so that includes most of those people. The overwhelming majority of those people will report themselves as not working by choice. And you can see here, since the end of the Second World War, since we've been keeping data, that share has typically been higher than it is today. So the entry of women into the labor force lowered this number. But it's typically, and you can see even now, it's 40%. If 42 was bad, 40 is still pretty bad. So no one uses that. My president of the Boston Fed, however, for a while, my boss, Eric, argued that we should look at a different unemployment rate, which is known as U6. So the standard unemployment rate that I told you was called U3, and as I explained, that's people who have been have looked for work in the last 4 weeks. And as I said, there's always been this question about whether the people who aren't looking for work are not looking for work. They say they're not looking for work, and one reason they could not be looking for work is that they're discouraged. So they gave up looking for work. And that seems like a bad way to measure unemployment, because you are saying that because the unemployment rate will go down, if a lot of people get discouraged and leave, then you're going to say that the unemployment rate has gone down, when in fact it's just because the economy is so weak. Okay, as it turns out, discouraged workers is actually very small. The number of people who report that the reason why they haven't looked for work is because they don't think they can find a job is a very, very small number. And then there's this other group which is marginally attached, which are people who say they are interested in working, but they haven't looked in the last 4 weeks. That's also small. The big group here in this broader definition of unemployment is people who are part-time for economic reasons, and that means they're working part-time, but they would like to work full-time, and the reason that they can't work full-time is because they can't find a full-time job. And so the labor market started improving in 2010, and about here, somewhere around here, people began to notice that the unemployment rate was actually, by kind of historic standards, fairly low. And at that time, people said, but it still seems like the economy isn't doing that well. And so people started looking at this other number, which included the part-time workers. And what you see is here, the unemployment rate is at the, roughly where it was at the peak of the previous cycle. But people pointed out that U6, including my boss, Eric, was actually high. And it is true that the number of part-time workers is unusually high by historic standards, or was, and even still is to some extent unusually high. And so the question was whether that reflected the weakness of the economy or whether that was part of some long-term trend toward part-time work. And the general consensus now is that to some extent, this shift to part-time for economic reasons is not because the economy is weak. It's just because there are a lot more part-time jobs than there used to be. And for various reasons which we don't understand. But the bottom line is now, we generally think the economy is, every labor market indicator we have suggests that there are not a lot of workers out there, a lot of spare workers out there. And that the economy is, as far as the labor market is concerned, is pretty close to capacity. Okay, so let me skip this, and let me go now to earnings. So the other thing that people look at is earnings, and so earnings are volatile. The changes in earnings are, so it's a little hard to take a read on them, but one of the things that has puzzled people about this recovery is if the labor market is so tight, why is earnings growth by historic standards fairly low? And so I think you've probably heard this, you read about it, people talk about why it is. So this is in 2007, so in what was not considered that strong a recovery, earnings growth was close to 4%. In this recovery, even now, it's somewhere closer to 2.5 or 3. So one question people have is if the labor market is so tight, if firms are competing for workers, why aren't they driving up wages? And there's a little sign of increased wage pressure, but it's still considerably below where it was in the last cycle, which we didn't consider a particularly strong recovery. So that's another thing, another kind of fact to put into the mix. And so one last thing is, one thing that is extraordinarily low by historic standards is new claims for unemployment insurance. So unemployment insurance, often people think that the unemployment rate is based on people who file claims for unemployment insurance. It isn't. The two surveys are completely unrelated. So new unemployment insurance, you can claim unemployment insurance if, under certain circumstances, if you're actively seeking work and you've been laid off from a job, you can claim unemployment insurance. And so what this chart shows is the number of claims, initial claims for unemployment insurance as a fraction, it's actually per as an annualized fraction of employment. And basically, this number has never been this low. So the president takes credit for it naturally, but the point is it's actually been at exceptionally low levels. It's been breaking records now since 2015. And so the number of people filing new claims for unemployment every month is just, you can see this is at the peak of the cycle in the 1970s. It was something like 50% more than it is today. And this remains, so this is a sign that the unemployment is good. Some people have said, no, it's not. It's a sign that people are, the economy has become less dynamic. There's fewer firms being created and fewer firms being destroyed, and that's a bad thing, and that's somehow related to slow productivity growth. Okay, so the last, in some ways, the most important way of looking at the labor market, and if you're going to take away one thing from today, it's this number. Okay, so this was a year and a half ago. Amazon said it was going to hire 100,000 workers over the next 18 months. So that sounds like a large number, 100,000 workers in 18 months. So I'm going to ask you, how long do you think it takes the U.S. economy to hire 100,000 workers? Like about 8 hours. So 100,000 workers is nothing. And so this is the number of workers hired per month in the U.S. economy. So right now, it's around 5.5 million workers. That's per month. And so if you think about that, that means about 60 million workers hired per year. And so you look at this and you say, wow, if there are only 200 million workers in the workforce, how can you hire 60 million people every month? And the answer, or 5 million people, or 60 million people in a year, or 5 million people every month. And the answer is because there's a lot of hiring, but there's also a lot of firing. So the U.S. economy, even when it's doing well, somewhere in the order of between 1.5 and 2 million workers get fired every month. And then you add in the people who quit, and you get total separations. And so total separations is just a little smaller than total hires. And so every month, we hire about 5.5 million workers, and about a little under that, about 200,000 less than that, about 5.3 million workers quit or lose their jobs. And so every month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the big headline number reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics is this number. It's net hiring. It's the difference between all the workers who were hired and all the workers who either quit or were laid off. And what you can see is that number is tiny. It's around 200,000 jobs. And so the hires so the net hiring is 200,000, and gross hiring is 5.5 million. So these are, most of the hiring in the economy is not taking people from unemployment. It's almost all of it is taking people who are currently employed. So if you need to hire 100,000 workers, if Amazon is hiring 100,000 workers, that's not net additions to employment. Those 100,000 workers, the overwhelming majority of those 100,000 workers, 98% of them are currently employed by someone else. And so what is the net effect of this announcement on the economy? And the answer is almost nothing. And so if you prevent Carrier from laying off 700 workers, what is the effect of that on the economy? And the answer is almost nothing. Most of those 700 workers will find other jobs. And that's how our economy works. So the overwhelming majority of hiring and firing and quitting in the United States is people moving from one job to another. And it's hard to understate that. It's not like, most of it, 75%. It's 98% of it. So most of the time, when workers, if there's something where you say, foreign trade has, there's a plant closing and 2,000, and 1,000 workers get laid off, and you say, oh my God, that's going to reduce employment by 1,000. We deal with that, orders of magnitude more than that every day. If laying off 1,000 people meant most of those people wouldn't find jobs, then, as I said, this is about 20 million people who get fired every year, right? And we're worrying about 700. But there's 20 million other people who lost their jobs last year who are getting nothing. And so the point is about this is our economy, what characterizes our economy is, and this is true of all developed economies, but especially ours, is this churn, this what we say background hum of job creation and job destruction. These workers are constantly moving from job to job. And we have some fantasy that there was a time when people worked at the same job for life. That was never, ever true. This has always been true that the economy is constantly reallocating workers across firms, across industries, across occupations, across all kinds of things, and that's happening at tremendous rates all the time. And it is especially true when the economy is doing well. So the kind of steady state of the economy involves enormous amounts of churn. Okay, but let me just say one other thing that's also incredible about this picture, which is the Great Recession is here. So there was an increase in layoffs during the Great Recession, but it was not big, and it was over fairly quickly. So what's amazing is that what happened in the Great Recession, this huge reduction in employment and increase in unemployment, was not that lots of workers got laid off. It was that the hiring rate went way down. So most of what's happening here is not an increase in separation. So you can see quits fell. Why? Because if you can't find another job, you're not going to quit the one you have. And you can see we had a huge reduction here in hiring. And so what a recession is mostly, a long recession is mostly a reduction in hiring, not an increase in firing. And so you might think that what happens in a layoff, firms lay off in a recession, firms lay off tons of workers. And you saw some of that. But most of what you saw was a decline in hiring, not a decline in, not an increase in firing. Okay. So let me conclude this discussion of the labor market. Is the economy doing well? Yes, the economy is doing very well. And so I say to you now, I'm saying this not as a representative of the Federal Reserve, and I'm saying it as apolitically as I possibly can, as someone who has not always voted for one or the other party. I want to say that any claim that policy in the last 2 years has dramatically changed the course of the U.S. economy is wrong. If you look here, you try and find in hiring here, so we just look at gross hiring, you try and find some event. You try and find some change in that path going from 2010, hiring has been increasing. There's nothing happened. Deregulation, tax reform, all these things that have happened in the last 2 years. And if you read the Wall Street Journal, they talk about it like the economy has somehow, nobody was hiring, and then suddenly there was this change in policy and we got a ton of hiring. Nothing has changed. The economy is basically doing more or less the same thing it's been doing really for the last 8 years now, which is hiring has been growing at a very steady rate, a little faster than separations, and so employment has been growing. But the idea that we're somehow in some dramatic change in economic conditions from a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago, the data does not bear that out. Okay, so I'm now going to just talk briefly about the tariffs. This figure isn't the most clear, but as of September 24th, which is when the last set of tariffs went into effect, we've imposed new tariffs on about 13% of American imports. And so the red area here, that's tariffs that have actually been imposed, and the blue area is tariffs that are proposed. And so this is, I could tell you anything. It's impossible to read this figure. So that's, I could be showing you, 1930. But in fact, this is September of 2018. And this is tariffs that have been proposed, and then the blue is proposed, the blue is the ones that have been implemented, the red is the ones that have been imposed, and this is the tariffs that have been imposed. Our trading partners have proposed retaliation and imposed some retaliation on the United States. But right now, the U.S. is imposing tariffs in a way that we haven't done, in a long, long time. And I'll actually discuss briefly when those other times are. But what is the logic behind this? Okay, so the president's view of trade, and I want to only defend the president in the sense that there are a lot of people who share his views on international trade, including a lot of Democrats and including a lot of so-called trade experts. And their idea is this: imports are bad and exports are good. And so if imports are greater than exports, the United States is getting screwed. And that is basically their philosophy. And so what the president says, the president says the trade balance is negative, we're importing more than we export, and therefore his logic is that we would be better off not trading at all because we're importing more than we export. And so the point is about this, you look at this, and it's true. It's not, it's true that you look at this and you think, oh my God, we're importing, the trade balance is negative, all this money is flowing out of the United States. And so the president actually used the word wealth transfer. And I think that's what people have in mind. They think somehow, look, this is 5% of GDP, 5% of our income is going to foreigners. They're just taking our money. Okay, what is an import? So this is wrong, and this is one of there are many things reasonable people can disagree about. This is not one of them. When we import, we get goods. Foreigners get money. That's what happens when you import something. We give them money, they give us goods. The value of the good to the buyer must be at least as valuable as the money he's giving up or she's giving up, otherwise they wouldn't do it. So if you buy a car, presumably you value the car more than you paid for it. If you don't value the car more than you paid for it, you wouldn't have bought it because you would be better off not buying the car. So what happens? People buy cars, we get a car, the Canadian or Mexican or German gets money. Are we poorer? At the very least, we're no worse, financially, we're no worse off because it's true we have less money, but we have more goods. And so let me give you an example to illustrate how insane it is to think about imports this way, is exports, according to this logic, are good because we get money. I mean, I'm saying Trump view of international trade. So imagine a forest. If you go in and you clear cut the forest, and you turn that forest into lumber, and you put that lumber on a ship, and you send it to China, that will be an export. And according to this, the United States will be better off. So if we clear cut all the forests in the United States and sent those trees overseas, we would be winners, and the rest of the world would be losers. And the reason is because nobody is taking into account the fact that we no longer have that forest, because our national wealth has fallen by the amount of the forest. And it's true that we have money, but we don't have the forest anymore. And that is the logic behind the president's trade policy, and it's why it seems so logical to him that his statement that trade wars are easy to win, his view is, well, trade wars are easy to win because we can't, if we just stop trading altogether, we're no worse off than we were now, and so we can just say, yeah, we'll end foreign trade entirely, and we'll be better off. And the answer is, we won't. We will be much, much worse off. Okay, so we're running low on time, so let me skip ahead to two historical examples about international trade and tariffs. So one of them is Smoot-Hawley. So Smoot-Hawley were tariffs that were imposed in 1929 and are widely blamed for causing or aggravating the Great Depression. So I don't know if you remember this. This is Ross Perot, Al Gore, and Larry King. So this is when they were debating NAFTA in the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994. And Gore is holding a framed picture of Smoot and Hawley, who were the two congressmen for whom this law, the tariffs, were named. And he gave it to Ross Perot and told him to frame it, to hang it in his office, and which was great theater, because he said, you know, you should take, you know, if you think this is a good idea, well, you should then honor these guys. And then he went on something about how Smoot-Hawley had caused the Great Depression. Okay, most economists think Smoot-Hawley had almost no effect on the Depression. It's true that Smoot-Hawley, after Smoot-Hawley, it imposed incredibly high tariffs, something on the order of 40%, so much higher than anything Trump has proposed. And it's true that the volume of international trade collapsed shortly thereafter. The problem with the theory is that, in fact, tariffs were already really high. They were already something like 35%. So it actually was a very small increase in tariffs at the time. And most of the decline in trade happened because of the depression, it didn't cause the depression. Okay, so Smoot-Hawley. Another historical example of a disruption of international trade was Brexit. So England's decision, or the United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union. Initial forecasts said it would have a big effect. So this dashed line here is the forecast before Brexit. And then when they announced Brexit, this was the revised forecast, which saw a depression. The original forecast was actually better than the revised forecast. So people generally overestimated the impact of Brexit. Okay, so why are we worried about this? So one risk that we face right now is escalation. So I said we haven't had tariffs like this in a long time. It's not as long. It's not since 1929. In 1971, President Nixon imposed an import surcharge of 10% on everyone in August 15th of 1971. Most people have forgotten this. The reason at the time, in particular, was a trade deficit with Japan. But what they did was the issue at the time was there were fixed exchange rates. So the dollar and the Japanese yen traded at a fixed ratio. So it was something like 300 yen to the dollar. And the US at the time demanded a revaluation of the yen and imposed this surcharge to get it. They got it. In December of 1971, there was an agreement to revalue the Japanese currency in December of 1971, and that was that. The problem right now is that there's nothing. The problem in this battle with China is, in 1971 there was a clear goal. Now there is no clear goal. Trump's view of trade, as I said, is that he wants to get rid of the trade balance, and the Chinese essentially have no control over the trade balance. The trade balance is determined by how many Americans want to buy Chinese goods. And so the Chinese government has almost no control over it. And so the problem right now in negotiating with China is it's not clear what China can give that it was very easy for Nixon to declare victory in December of 1971 because he had a clear goal. The problem right now is that there's no clear goal. And so if we don't get anything, the risk is they'll just keep raising the ante until we have no trade, till we actually do have no trade with China. Okay, and so the second issue is that right now all the forecasts, including the ones that we've done, point to a very small effect of international trade, of the tariffs on the economy. And the reason is very simple. It came as a shock to me. I was writing this memo about international trade on a desk on which everything on my desk was made in China. The computer was made in China, the monitor was made in China, the keyboard was made in China, everything on my desk was made in China. But it turns out that Chinese imports are only about 3% of economic activity. And it's very hard to get 3% of economic activity to cause a recession. So I say that, but I'm putting up this picture here. This is a picture of forecasts of economic activity done by the Federal Reserve in 2008. So this here was our forecast in August of 2008, so right before the economy collapsed. This is of unemployment. So we forecast a rise of unemployment here. This is a forecast in which we said everything was going to go wrong. Worst case scenario. Someone said, let's do a forecast in which we think the worst possible thing is going to happen. That's what we forecast. This is what actually happened. So we forecast the unemployment rate was going to go to 6.5, and it went to 10. And the reason was, at the time, was that the same logic I'm giving you now. The problems in the economy in 2008 appeared to affect a sufficiently small sector of the economy that people just didn't think it could have a very big effect. And so right now, the fear we have is that there's something we're missing, as we were in 2008, and that's why we're going to end up, and so it's something we don't know that we're going to end up over here. So I can see Ann is getting antsy. This is the slide you've all been waiting for, which is the end.